now under rocket fire in Beirut.
This is one of the most shocking things that I personally have seen.
I've been covering wars for The Sun for more than 30 years, and there's always a moment of trepidation mixed with a bit of excitement when you put your bags into the cab and set off for the airport. It's a bit weird leaving behind your family and the safety and security of an ordinary suburban life, but exciting because you never know what situations you're going to find yourself in. Heading for Ukraine this time was a new experience for myself and photographer Doug Seberg, because we'd opted to take the sleeper train across the border to Kyiv after flying out to Warsaw in Poland. We got our own little sleeper compartment on the 17-hour overnight train. They actually stopped the train and changed the wheels at the border because of Ukraine's rail network still runs on the old Soviet-style tracks. Neither of us got much sleep on the bumpy journey before we watched dawn break over the icy grey sky as we neared Kyiv. And then just then, a missile alert sounded on our phones. We were arriving in the Ukrainian capital just as it was coming under missile attack. A Russian ballistic missile had landed right next to the tube station, blown up an entire block of flats and an office block, incinerated 2 people in their cars, and also killed a McDonald's security guard. Welcome to Ukraine. The same day we arrived in Kyiv, we came across somebody who I'd actually spoken to before, but I was quite amazed that he was still there. It was 3 years since I'd last learned of his work as a paramedic on the front line.
He had amputation to the right leg, sort of halfway down his thigh.
Where was his leg?
Sort of 3 or 4 meters, just down on the side. What was left of it, anyway. I'm assuming it was his, because it was the same boot he was wearing. It's kind of hard to tell sometimes, so I put a tourniquet on him.
He'd been home, I think, a couple of times, but he'd spent the vast majority of the past 3 years right on the front line, right in the thick of it, and said he'd saved dozens of lives. It was quite inspiring to talk to him, hearing just how he'd stuck with it, really. It was very, very impressive, and his motives that he outlined to us were also very, very impressive.
You can't sit there and say, this is wrong, and then write about it on the internet and not actually do the actions to make that thing better.
We then moved east from Kyiv. It was quite a long journey, about a 5-hour road trip to the city of Dnipro. We arranged, through a helper we had with us, to go to meet some of the drone crews in the front line, the Ukrainian drone crews. This involved driving quite close to the front line, but obviously we didn't want to, in view of the danger, get within drone range. Drones can basically threaten anybody 12 miles either side of the front line now. There's thousands of them in the air at any one time. So we went slightly out of range and moved to an open area to meet these guys. They said the best way to demonstrate their skills was to hunt me down, which they promptly did. They gave me a head start, and very, very quickly I was caught. And it was a very, very unnerving experience.
The sound, they're on top of me now.
We also got to meet a guy. He's actually the guy who hunted me down in the exercise. He didn't give me his full name, but he described himself. He used his call sign. He calls himself the moderator. One of the lines he came up with was that I used to moderate social media sites. That was my old job before the war. Now I moderate Russians.
Can I ask you how many Russians you've actually killed during the course of the conflict? Do you know?
Less than 100.
You personally?
Yeah. Less than 100. I think it's about maybe 50, 60.
It just laid bare the vulnerability of anybody caught out in the open, anywhere near the front line in modern warfare.
If I was a soldier, it would probably be the last thing I'd see.
We went back to Dnipro. While we were there, we picked up what sounded like a very, very promising lead for a story about a British fighter right in the thick of it, in the front line, who was actually working as a soldier, who we learned was called Alexander Garms-Rizzi. Well, I only learned his identity afterwards. Spoke to me on the Saturday where he was going to tell us everything in a secret location quite close to the front line. He never showed up because while we were waiting to do that interview, he was killed in action. We discovered that Alexander, who was a former Welsh Fusilier, had died a hero. We were told that he was with a 4-man team that went forward to carry out an operation. He was working as a sniper at the time. He and his team, they were located by the enemy and began to take very heavy incoming fire. a bunker they were in was destroyed. He covered them, basically. He led the drone away from them, the drone attack away from them, so that they could escape. His 3 colleagues all made it to safety, though one was seriously wounded. Alexander, who ran the other way to draw the fire, unfortunately was killed. He was a very brave lad, a very young lad, and he died fighting for something he believed in. While we were in Donetsk, when we first entered the area which all the troops go through to reach the war zone, we saw a very, very large flag-decked shrine to encourage soldiers going into battle from this point and to salute those who've fallen. But just a few days later, we discovered that the shrine, this huge monument, had to be covered with netting because virtually every day it's being attacked by Russian drones. It's come into range because the Russians are getting closer. They are pushing and pushing and taking over huge swathes of territory.
Attention, air raid alert. Proceed to the nearest shelter. Don't be careless. Your overconfidence is your weakness.
After spending some time in Kyiv, which is attacked on a regular basis, our phone alerts were very active while we were there. We moved out to the cemetery on the outskirts of town. This is a place where literally thousands of Ukrainian war dead from the past 3 years now lie buried. At the start of the war, there were just a few dozen graves there from the start of the conflict, the 2014 conflict. We were quite taken aback by what we saw. It was quite moving because virtually every headstone was etched with the face of the young people who've been killed in this war. The cost of this war, the cost of Vladimir Putin's war, is very, very high, and it was laid bare here. The atmosphere in Ukraine, particularly the further east you go, is obviously very sombre and stressful, and the alerts are constant and the threat is constant. Back in Kyiv, though, even though this is another city that gets regularly attacked, we were quite impressed by the resilience of Ukrainians and how they insist that life must go on. An ordinary life, to the best of their ability, does go on despite all this. We found people salsa dancing in a basement club. We found pizza restaurants busy. We went to a street market where on a Sunday where people were out and about just trying their hardest to, despite the pressure they're under, get on with their lives, and all credit to them. It was very, very impressive indeed. On our way out back towards the Polish border, we stopped off at Lviv, which is in the extreme west of Ukraine. We went to the Superhuman Centre to look at how Ukraine is helping its war wounded, and there were many, many amputees there. We were interviewing one of the few there that spoke very good English. He was actually an American guy who'd been fighting for Ukraine when he lost his left foot, and he was just chatting to him and him talking about his own experiences, that he mentioned a young British guy who he was a very, very close friend of, who'd been killed. And he told us that this guy, who he named only as James, had died in his arms. A British teenager has died in a terrifying Russian drone hunt minutes into his first ever combat mission on the Ukraine front line. It turned out that this guy was James Wilton. We spoke to James's family and they eventually gave us permission for his identity to be used. It turned out to be an incredibly tragic story. James had only been in Ukraine for 4 months. He'd only just turned 18. He wasn't even 18 when he arrived. He was on his very, very first mission with Ukrainian forces alongside the American guy I was talking to.
I close my eyes. I'm just holding on to my friend. It's above my head for a good 5 or so seconds, just hovering. And then after 5 seconds, it just leaves. And I open my eyes, and I don't have time to think about it. I open my eyes and I say, okay, let's go. And I look down at my friend, and he's dead.
You knew he was dead at that point?
He was completely unresponsive. Just dead. No more breathing, anything.
It was a very tragic story. Again, showed the incredible human cost of this war and how foreign fighters, including Brits, are being caught up in it. We spent nearly 3 weeks in Ukraine, and I can't help but feeling worried for the nation's incredibly brave people as I crossed the border into Poland. Brave young Ukrainians and foreign fighter comrades, like British teenager James Wilton and Alexander Garms-Rizzi, are falling every day in battle as Putin sacrifices many more of his own men to grab ground. Putin doesn't care because he knows he has many more times as many men as his enemy, and Ukraine will eventually run out of recruits. The brave warriors I've met in the last few weeks and the civilians will fight on, backed by millions of ordinary Ukrainians who want to stay free. But for a lot of Ukrainians, it's now clear that an end to this war cannot come soon enough. I hope for their sake and ours that Donald Trump makes good on his promise to stop the bloodshed as soon as possible.